All right, let's begin. My name is Shane Silas. Welcome to Uncovering Bitcoin. The agenda for this talk is to tell you, what Bitcoin is, tell you who I am. I want to give you a little bit of the kind of human story and mystery that surrounds Bitcoin, and then talk mainly about the technical story. What problem did Bitcoin solve that hadn't been solved before? And then talk a little bit about the nomenclature for Bitcoin, some of which I think is fine, and some of which I think is actually really bad. And then talk about where to go from here, provide you with other resources. So, what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is the first decentralized cryptocurrency. It solves a long-standing computer science problem known as the Byzantine generals problem, and I'll talk more about that. And unlike the adage, there's nothing new under the sun, I think Bitcoin is something new under the sun, and even I'd say go so far as to say worthy of consideration for a Nobel Prize in economics. A little bit about myself. My background is in computer science and evolutionary robotics. I'm now using that in video game development. So I'm interested in evolutionary robotics, video games. Bitcoin is just kind of a side thing because I think it's an interesting new thing in the world. I also like mechanical keyboards. It's just an oddball thing. What I actually do is develop video games and assets in Unity. I just released this one, Mini Buffer. This is my plug. If you like Emacs or Vim or the Unix shell, and you want to have something like that you can drop into in your game, that's for you. And there's been a lot of talk about a lot of talks concerning Clojure. So just as a shout out to people if you don't know, if you'd like to do essentially Clojure development in Unity, there's a really great project called Arcadia. There we go. Now we're done with video games. That's an errant slide. So Bitcoin, this is the human story, and it's a mystery. Who made Bitcoin? There's actually a good answer for that. Satoshi Nakamoto. Here's his white paper where he published what he did. There's an email address here. Perhaps at one point you could actually contact him that way. Problem is, nobody knows who Satoshi Nakamoto is. This is a pen name. So, as a lesson to you, if you ever release a piece of software that's dangerous enough, don't release it under your real name. Who is Satoshi Nakamoto? I've been referring to him as a man, but there's actually no evidence for that. We don't know if it's a man, a woman, a group of people. Early on there was speculation that it was this mathematician. That was wrong. There's a Australian inventor who claimed to be Satoshi Nakamoto. I think it's a fraudulent claim. He had a bunch of weird things that you had to do, sign an NDA to verify his identity. And Satoshi Nakamoto's work was, if you can present a private key, then you're authorized, to spend perhaps millions of dollars. So the idea that he would have all this rigmarole just to identify himself is, to me, absurd. So what do we know about Satoshi Nakamoto? Seems to be academically inclined. He has interests in a broad range of things, namely cryptography, economics, computer science, and anonymity. And when he essentially bootstrapped the Bitcoin system, he was the first miner. And when you're a miner, you get rewards for mining Bitcoin. And he's currently thought to have 1 million Bitcoin in his, in his public address. Now, the weird thing is, he hasn't touched these Bitcoins. Not since he kind of, disappear. So I think it's likely that Satoshi Nakamoto is one person, partly because there's so much money here left on the table, and it hasn't moved. We can watch it. We know if it does move. And he conceived of and developed this thing more or less by himself. So this was kind of his side project, and he seems to have essentially netted himself $4 billion just for himself, neglecting the whole market cap for Bitcoin, which I think is pretty good for a side project. So he might not be winning the Nobel Prize, but he's got other compensations. So he apparently started coding Bitcoin in 2007. He released the white paper in 2008, and he went silent in 2010. And Bitcoin's kind of been steered by a different organization of developers since then. So that's kind of the mystery that I just want to leave you with of Bitcoin's origin. Now I want to get into the technical side of things. We'll come back to hashing. This is my riff on Tolkien here. We'll come back to that. So when you're talking about Bitcoin, there's actually at least three things that people are talking about, and I think it's useful to discriminate between them. There's the code that actually runs Bitcoin. Then there's the blockchain that has been created by Bitcoin that records all the transactions that have ever happened in Bitcoin. And then there's the currency. So let's kind of dive into, before we get into the particulars of each of those, let's talk about just some things that make Bitcoin very peculiar compared to all the other software and services that we have. One is, there is no user registration for Bitcoin. There is no miner registration for Bitcoin. You don't have to provide any information about Bitcoin to have it recognize you as a legitimate user. If I could have a show of hands, how many people own or have owned Bitcoin at one point? Okay, great. I would like to entreat those who don't have a Bitcoin public address to, just privately to yourself, I want you to think of a number, any number, something that you don't assume people would guess. It could be a birth date, it could be a string of text, you could think of it as a password, but with that, you could turn that into a Bitcoin public address, and somebody could send you, whatever amount of money they wish to send you. Essentially, without you talking to Bitcoin's network, you are able to essentially be a user that can now receive money. Now, what other service can you say that about? Like, you think of all the rigmarole you have to go through just to get some free thing versus forget about something that requires money like PayPal, where there's a waiting period. And there's all these other constraints around know your customer. So Bitcoin is just it's like a piece of alien software in that respect. It just has a very different sense of values that it represents. Another peculiarity is there will only be 21 million Bitcoins ever. That's the policy that Nakamoto set up. People then call this deflationary, because instead of constantly pumping money into the system and then thereby devaluing other parts of the currency, this is supposed to be, essentially the currency will become more and more valuable over time. That's the claim anyway. Also, Bitcoins are losable. Many people who started out early when Bitcoin was worth nothing, mined it on a lark, got hundreds of Bitcoins, because the payout initially was 50 Bitcoins every time you mined a block. It was a fun experiment. It wasn't worth anything. They cleared their hard drive, they removed some stuff, and they lost it. So there's you can definitely lose Bitcoin. And there's no safeguard. There's no way like, oh well, talk to the Bitcoin administrators and you can get it back. None of that. Transactions are irreversible. So you make a transaction, oh, you did the wrong thing. Oh well, there's no chargebacks. There's no person to appeal to other than the person you sent the money to ask for them to send it back. So no one can spend Bitcoins but the private key holder of the public address that the Bitcoins are at. Not a miner, not an attacker that's successful, not a government, not Satoshi Nakamoto himself. So if you do have private keys, don't lose them. Let's talk about Bitcoin, the Bitcoin entities that actually exist in the Bitcoin system. So there's the public address. That's where people can send money to. It just looks like a big, long string of hexadecimal numbers. There's the private key. This is what you can use to spend money. And there's a transaction, which is essentially like a check, where you list your transactions as input, and then you say where they're going to what public addresses. A block is just a collection of transactions, and the Bitcoin blockchain is a collection of tamper-proof blocks. So those are the entities that exist in the kind of Bitcoin, universe that I think is kind of important just to put in front of you. So let's talk about the currency, which is kind of the easiest part of this. Bitcoin on this chart in 2010 was trading for 7 cents a Bitcoin, and over here, recently it peaked at 5,000, had a big media thing, and when I put this slide together, it was worth about 3,500 per Bitcoin, which is kind of crazy, and it's the reason people, I think, are starting to pay attention to it. Like, is it, I think one of the, the main questions still is like, is Bitcoin fake money? And my answer is yes, Bitcoin is absolutely fake money. But, there's a curious quality here. Money is also fake. There is no physical atom that's a dollar, right? There's no physics to this. This gives me a great opportunity to jump into a Philip K. Dick quote, which is, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. And this is a really good test for assessing whether you've got a kind of physical thing in the world. It is, however, not so good at testing all the other things in the world that have power and can compel people to do things, but aren't because of the physics. So I like to, this is my corollary for Philip K. Dick's quote. Shared reality is that which, when everyone stops believing in it, does go away. So there's a lot of different entities for which this is true. For instance, yeah, absolutely. So there's all these things that by consensus, by kind of majority consensus, we have created and that we could disband. Money is one of those things. The government is another. Norms. All these things are things that are very powerful in our world, but they're powerful because of the people that have bought into them. So that's what I'll leave you with, concerning Bitcoin and if it's money. So let's talk about Bitcoin, the code. So this is the code that runs Bitcoin. It's open source. It's under an MIT license. You can grab it, you can run it, and one thing that I think is a little interesting here about the open source part is it's not open source because that was nice. It's necessarily open source. Nobody was going to trust this unless they had the code for it. let's see, and this has spawned a lot of different cryptocurrencies because code is out there. Litecoin, in this case, is one where they've essentially taken Bitcoin code and they changed some of the policies behind it. They change some of the proof of work algorithms, and then they run it themselves and they create a whole new blockchain. There's other cryptocurrencies that spawned up in response to this. There's even more cryptocurrencies that have spawned, and most of these are worthless, right? Like somebody made it on a lark. Dogecoin, one of the actually quite successful cryptocurrencies, is a joke, but it has a monetary value. And if you haven't seen the whole Doge, thing, how you read this is, wow, much coin, how money, so crypto. Please mine, very rich, very currency. Wow. But people like jokes. People share jokes. So Dogecoin is more popular than some very serious projects out there. Okay, the blockchain. This is kind of, I think, the most interesting part. So Bitcoin mining solves a really important problem. It solves the Byzantine generals problem. So I'm going to describe the problem to you. So the Byzantine generals problem is that you've got these group of generals, and they're all trying to formulate a plan to attack and conquer this castle. Now, if they can coordinate together and all attack at the same time, then they'll win. But they have to communicate with each other by message, and they have traitors in their midst. So they can't trust everyone in their circle. So they have to find some way, by some method, that they can overcome this challenge. What method can they use when they're worried? So let me translate this problem into what this means for Bitcoin. So in Bitcoin's terminology, a trader here is somebody who wants to do a double spend. Somebody who wants to say, give you money, and then say, I'm going to give you money instead. And then maybe he's already got his goods from you, and he's surreptitiously funded his money elsewhere. So that's what the trader is for Bitcoin. They want to spend the same Bitcoin. BTC is just the abbreviation for the Bitcoin denomination, twice. So the general in this case is a miner, somebody looking to mine the next block in the blockchain. And if the generals conquer the castle, then this means that essentially the ledger records faithfully, the transactions and doesn't allow for any double spending. If the generals are defeated by the traders, the ledger is compromised such that an attacker is able to effectively double spend. And so the Bitcoin solution to this, and I think this is something that was really revelatory when I was learning about Bitcoin, is the solution that Bitcoin does is it holds a lottery. And they call this mining, but I think the way to think of it is they hold a lottery to elect one person to be the banker. They play one round as the banker. They take a bunch of the transactions, they validate them, they put them into a list, and then they say, this is the next block, guys. I've got it. And they get a reward from Bitcoin. So there's a problem with this. You want to hold a lottery online. Normally, you'd have people pay for tickets. This is kind of looked down upon if you're trying to create your own currency, right? So one of the constraints is that tickets can't cost money. Now there's a problem, when you're online, nobody knows that you're a dog. Nobody knows that you represent one person or 10,000 people. So how, and you can fake so many things online. You can fake where your location is, you can fake, data that you're a person of a certain nationality, So what is it that you cannot fake online? How is it that you can limit, essentially, the distribution of these tickets in a way that's fair? Well, you can't fake your compute power. Your CPU can do so much, and that is essentially what Bitcoin, has adopted. They call this proof of work. Now we have to talk about hashing. So let's. This is my ode to Tolkien and Nakamoto. One hash to name them, one hash to hide them, one hash to compel them, and in the light bind them. So hashing. Hashing, if you've done computer programming, you've probably already familiar with this somewhat. It's supposed to be a kind of a one-way computation. You put in kind of any amount of data, and then you get a fixed data size output. So you can think of it as you put something in, you get a number out. We use this all the time for performance reasons in things like dictionaries, sometimes just called hash tables because they use hash. And this can also serve as a signature or a name. This is just an aside, and also a practical tip. One of the basic Boolean functions is XOR. It's a nonlinear function, and if you ever want to make a hash of some kind of composite type, you can probably just take the hash code of each of them and XOR them. Now, why XOR? Because basically, if any bit of its input is changed, then its output is changed, which is a good property for hashes. And I think one of the things that's just cool about this is, we're taking something that is essentially hard to solve, but we're using that as a property that essentially is what makes Bitcoin work. If hashes were solvable, if you go backwards from a hash, then Bitcoin falls apart. So cryptographic hashes have a few other properties on top of what the kind of cheap and loose performance hashes that we use for different data structures. One is that it's collision resistant. If you have two different objects, they in general shouldn't hash to the same thing. It's hiding, so if you have a secret value that you concatenate with your value, it's hard to find out what that other value is. It's puzzle friendly. This becomes important with the whole mining thing. That it's infeasible to find that value R in this case. So we apply this to Bitcoin mining, where you have a block, all these transactions, and you have what's called a nonce. A nonce is just a random value that you pick out of the air. But what you're trying to do is get it such that it's actually underneath a certain difficulty. This is set by everybody's trying to basically find one nonce. They can do this by incrementing the nonce and evaluating it and just trying to find it. They could do it by just randomly selecting it. But that is essentially the solution to the block. And once somebody finds this for themselves, they announce it to everybody and they say, hey, I have a block that works, and they receive Bitcoin for it. Everybody checks it, and if it's legitimate, then they start working on the next block. So this is how the hash lottery works. So each of these nonces is essentially your lottery ticket. And you evaluate it, and you find out, did I win or not? Right? This is like a scratch-off. And you can have as many tickets as you can compute. The Bitcoin lottery is set up to happen every 10 minutes. And this is because essentially it slides that scale for the difficulty, depending on how many people are hashing, depending on how many people are participating. And right, so the winner announces their block to everybody. Everybody checks it. If it's good, they start mining the next block. And by the way, if you ever do any of these Bitcoin transactions, people will talk about if the transaction has been confirmed. That means that it's actually been put into a block, so it's actually part of the irrevocable record of transactions. All right, let's talk about Bitcoin's nomenclature. Good, the bad, and the ugly. If you get into this and you start looking on the Bitcoin communities, you'll hear people, they talk about fiat money. what is this? This is money by decree, otherwise known as real money. This is essentially money that the government has said, this is a value. You should use this. The US dollar is an instance of fiat money. You'll hear people talk about Satoshis with a lowercase s. This is essentially the smallest unit of Bitcoin currently. It's so each Bitcoin is 100 million Satoshis. So you don't have to buy in big, like, $3,500 increments. You can buy as little Bitcoin as you like. People talk about Bitcoin wallets. I'm not a fan. I think this is a bad piece of terminology. Because if somebody steals your wallet, you're kind of liable to notice, right? There's money there that you're not able to get. But if instead they copy your keys, you're not going to notice because you still have your keys. And then with Bitcoin, it's the same way. Like if somebody steals / copies / sees your wallet, essentially all your Bitcoin are vulnerable to being spent to their account. So I think this is better. It shouldn't be a Bitcoin wallet. It should be Bitcoin keys. Don't share them with anyone. Bitcoin mining, as you may have guessed, I think is kind of a bad one. I think this should be thought of as a lottery. I think that's a more apt way of thinking about it. Blockchain. I actually don't hate this one. This one's good. But just to kind of demystify it a little bit, what is it? The Bitcoin blockchain is a linked list. Now, it's got one kind of special property about it. Instead of using pointers like we do with linked lists and data structures, it uses hashes. So, and the hashes are the thing that essentially certify it, and that's why we can have this tamper-proof, append-only, data structure that nobody else can mess with. Because if they mess with a few values down here, it changes the hash, and then it changes the parent's hash, and so it's very difficult to ever try to edit one of these transactions. Let's talk about one of the things that goes on with the blockchain technology stuff is, all right, I'm running out of time here, but people will say, blockchain, the technology, it's good. It'll be, but Bitcoin, it's bad. I don't like it. And I guess, my question is, what is the blockchain minus Bitcoin, minus this innovation of having people agree on some shared state of the world that is decentralized, that no one person controls, that everybody can trust without having some centralized third party? I have an answer, and I think actually you guys will appreciate what this means. Well, Git. Git is a source control scheme, but it does use cryptographic hashes to essentially ensure and to organize its commits. Now, it's not exactly a chain, right? Because it can have branching structure and all these other things, but without the whole idea of kind of centralizing and mining and having this kind of shared state, I think you have Git, which is like a fantastic piece of software, but we were doing source control before Git, so I don't think it represents kind of the innovation that we have with Bitcoin. So where to go from here? Bitcoin is a tool. You can think of it as a kind of shared database for multiple non-trusting writers. There's a lot of enthusiasm. A lot of people want to kind of, find an excuse to bake it into their next project. And I think probably in a lot of cases this might be inappropriate, but I think it's worth thinking of it as just another tool in your possible toolkit. That said, it's a very cool tool. It allows you to do something that up till now has been kind of a reserved privilege for nation states. So I mean, I think that's really neat. If you do decide that your problem merits its own blockchain, I encourage you to check out multi-chain. They've essentially dug deep into the Bitcoin code and have created something that you can use as a private blockchain solution, as a something that you can essentially just edit a config file, run it, and with your own properties. Maybe you're like 21 million coins, that's not for me. I need 100 million coins. Then you can go in and change that. Another thing, colored coins are. This is a way to essentially try to add new assets to the blockchain. So maybe you want to do movie tickets, or video game points or whatever. You can add these kind of as a foreign entity on the blockchain, on the Bitcoin blockchain. You can add them as native entities on the multi-chain. So these are the references. I really like, well, both Nakamoto's white paper. It's a very short read. It's, I think, very clear. If you want a really in-depth thing that goes into the kind of cryptography and the hash stuff, read this from some professors at Princeton, Bitcoin and Cryptocurrency Technologies. It's available as a book. They also have a preprint that you can just download. And this is a blog post from Multichain where it just talks about where it is that you want to use Bitcoin. And despite them being purveyors of a Bitcoin solution, I thought it was really kind of admirable that they really went out and said, you don't want to just do this for any old project. All right, well, thank you.
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier that Bitcoin doesn't cost money, but I think it would in terms of computational power that you're running your machines. And I was wondering how these are being treated by the government, especially in terms of like income.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So the tax implications of Bitcoin. So right now, Bitcoin is treated as a capital asset. For some people, this is something good. If you want to use it as a kind of investment. If you want to use it to buy coffee, it's a bit of a downside. So what this means is when you buy Bitcoin, great, nothing happens. When you sell Bitcoin, this becomes a taxable event. If you sell it within less than a year than you acquired it, you treat it as short-term capital gains. If you sell it after a year, you treat it as long-term capital gains. And most, yeah.
I was just wondering like why anyone would sell it in the United States rather than sell it in a country that doesn't necessarily have a tax law and then just convert that currency.
Well, I mean, you could certainly like make that argument that there's an advantage for different nations that have different tax laws. I don't know. The thing is, if you're in the United States and you've contacted somebody like Coinbase, say, that sells bitcoins and buys bitcoins, they do have know your customer laws, and I think over a certain amount of money they will report it to the IRS. I am on the side of this is an ascent technology, but I think if you have any fear or doubt about it, and if you're doing it at any kind of like sums of money that are like over $100, like it behooves you to just pay your taxes on it and not have the IRS
just
check up on you.
The IRS wants to tax your profits out of the country too.
Yeah.
Whether or not you can get away with it is another question, but no matter where you make your money, they want that.
Well, by no means am I promoting that.
Some kind of government body like the IRS have for trying to figure out how to tax you. Say you did pay for your coffee with it at some kind of merchant who accepts Bitcoin. How would they report that? And how are they compelled to report that if Bitcoin transactions are anonymous?
They are. It's a great question. So the coffee shop, I don't think you have to worry about. And I don't think it's a little bit of a strange area. It's these basically Bitcoin right now has a couple of like essentially entrance and exit nodes. And for the most part, these are the main sellers of and buyers of Bitcoin, which are things like Coinbase. So these institutions, you have to tell them, your name, your address, give them access to oftentimes your bank account. They have a waiting period. So essentially, they know who you are. And so that is how I think the most likely avenue that the IRS will be looking at in order to ensure tax compliance. But once you have Bitcoin, if you can pay for things in Bitcoin rather than going through exit and entrance nodes that are in other denominations, then it's still traceable is the thing. You're right that it is pseudo-anonymous. They don't know whose identity is attached to every public address. But if it comes out of your Coinbase account, goes somewhere else and then somewhere else, they can certainly track that.
A follow-up question.
Yep.
Is it true though that the Bitcoin Core wallet changes your address every time you make a transaction?
Yeah, but there's still a trail, right? Even if you send it to a new public address as your kind of change wallet, it's still, I don't know. Yeah.
How are the blocks broadcast?
The blocks are broadcast basically, we just have a peer-to-peer network that you can essentially join up and say, hey, I'm new,
Just a peer-to-peer network?
give
That's
me...
a hard problem.
No, it's, yeah. That part I'm actually a little bit less clear on, but...
Seems like almost the hardest problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, so,
The Byzantine general problem is about segregated networks, and like, if your peer-to-peer network is segregated, then...
Well, it's okay. So they have a way of essentially dealing with that. So, you don't need perfect communication. You don't need to have like everybody. You don't need to ensure that messages are, actually getting to everybody. You actually just need the nodes to make a best effort. And if you get a segregated network and people will start essentially building up their own blockchains, the way that kind of ambiguity is dealt with is when they reconnect, whoever has the longest blockchain wins. So, the other people who are,
Too bad.
It actually
Yeah,
happens about once every 2 weeks to the tune of about 1 block.
What's that?
That happens about once every 2 weeks and it's 1 block.
Oh,
Oh,
okay. So that's not too bad. We'll block.
What do you think about the claims that Satoshi is not a person or a small group, but it's actually like a government or an institution?
It's an interesting claim. I mean, I think that is kind of maybe the other thing that you could go for. But I wonder, like, what is the aim, of that government entity, which is kind of an interesting, question to ask.
Any thoughts on the Halfpenny claim then?
What's that?
Halfpenny? The neighbor of the supposed Satoshi Nakamoto?
Oh.
The programmer who actually participated with the original correspondence with Satoshi.
I don't. Did he die?
He did.
He did die recently, or not recently, but.
I think, yeah, he was very, very disabled.
Right, yeah. And he got a lot of money out of the whole thing. Maybe I'm misremembering this, but did he like do some cryogenic thing?
He did. Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe those bitcoins are on hold.
Pay that $4 billion probably cover some projects. Or...
Yeah.
Do you think the proof of work algorithm that Bitcoin uses could be vulnerable in the future to something like quantum computing?
So that's a great question. So there's a couple. It's not vulnerable if you. Okay, I have to back up just a little bit. So we talked about public addresses and private keys. There's also public keys. So the first time that you spend your Bitcoin, you have to reveal your public key. When you reveal your public key on essentially in your transaction, then you are vulnerable to quantum computing kind of attack. But if you're doing like this gentleman suggested that they do in the wallet, where you point your change address to a new address that hasn't revealed its public key, then you're safe. So
Circling your funds.
yeah. So one thing to say about this, I'm talking about a change address. So one of the things that's a little bit weird about Bitcoin is when you make a transaction, you can't spend a little bit of it. You have to spend it all. So this is kind of like if you had to write a check to somebody and you would say, okay, I'm going to give you 20 bucks, and then I'm going to redirect all the rest of my account back to myself. But this is what you have to do on the Bitcoin transactions. The reason for it is you want to find out if a transaction has been spent. So all you have to do to find that out is look in the blockchain and see if it already exists. If it exists, you're done. It's been spent. You don't accept it. Yeah, that's why you have change addresses. Yeah.
So if the block, or if each block in the blockchain contains a certain number of transactions, and each of those transactions are the product of transactions before it, in order to verify a block, in addition to incrementing a nonce, you'd have to also verify all of the transactions within the block, which would require verifying every transaction in history, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, but essentially you do that essentially kind of the first time. So when the miners, if you're a new miner, you join the network and you say, hey, give me the latest blockchain, and they give you the whole block, and you should actually go through and verify it because again, there could be people giving you data that's bad. You would verify that essentially all the blocks that you keep in your record are good. And then that means that when you put together your proposed new block and it has transactions in it, you verify that all of the inputs have never been spent before. So you can do that once, and then you can do a bunch of nonsense on that same block again and again and again.
One of the things that strikes me, and maybe this is for the better, is that a lot of the economic policy that you see for currency control is not applicable to this because there's no centralized government monitoring it. So do you think that this could inevitably lead to a more volatile economic situation for every nation and everyone around the world? Like if Bitcoin crashes and it becomes like a big enough thing, couldn't that really just screw things up?
If it wasn't open source without 1,000 other copies.
Well, I mean, I think Bitcoin is really kind of a reaction to a financial system in which there are essentially a lot of kind of controls at the government level, such as setting monetary policy, of inflation, of fractional reserve banking, so. I think Bitcoin is trying to replace the government as the arbiter and trying to instead have, trust the code, trust the math, it's going to deal with you, impartially, whereas, the government, is going to, if they have a banking collapse, they're going to be like, well, everybody has to take a haircut, everybody has to lose 10% of their money in order for us to be solvent. And I think Bitcoin is
supposed to stop in 1 minute.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.